السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. مش عارف تعرفوا كويس سلوفينيا مكانها فين، أو سلوفينيا هي إيه، كانت فين وراحت لفين. سلوفينيا هي بلد مش ضخم، ولكن هي بلد كانت جزء من يوغوسلافيا السابقة، وسنة 91 أصبحت جمهورية مستقلة، والنهاردة هي واحدة من البلاد اللي محققة تقدم الحقيقة مش بطال في شرق أوروبا. النهاردة عندنا ضيف مميز، هو الرئيس السابق لسلوفينيا، هو الرئيس الثالث لسلوفينيا، وفي نفس الوقت هو بيعد نفسه عشان يخاطر ان هو يخوض معركة انه يترشح كأمين عام للأمم المتحدة. كان في لقاء قبل هذا التسجيل بساعات قليلة مع الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي ومجموعة من المحادثات والنقاشات. حوارنا النهاردة هيدور عن سلوفينيا، هيدور عن شرق أوروبا، هيدور عن الأمم المتحدة، هيدور عن الأمن والسلام في العالم. لو وصل لمنصب المتحدة هيكون إيه التوجه بتاعه؟ الأمم المتحدة واخدانا ورايحة بينا على فين؟ وخصوصا إن في ناس كتير أكيد حضراتكم منهم عندكم نوع من أنواع الإحباط من الدور اللي بتلعبه الأمم المتحدة في الفترة الأخيرة، ومنتظرين إن أكتر يحصل في ده. خلوني أرحب بفخامة الرئيس دكتور دانيال أوتشيرك، الرئيس السابق لسلوفينيا ومرشح سلوفينيا لمنصب الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة. You're most welcome, sir.
I'm pleased to be here.
Pleased to meet you. Sir, you had a meeting earlier with President Sisi, and you had some discussions running. What did you discuss, and what was going on in the meeting?
Well, we discussed a wide range of questions, some of them relating to global security situation, the role of the United Nations, other being more closely related to the current stage of development of Egypt and in the region. And very interestingly, we also discussed the current situation and the future of the cooperation around the River Nile, the Nile cooperation between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia.
You did discuss that.
Oh yes, I'm very interested in this subject because I think that water cooperation is a very important ingredient in global peace. There are many arrangements around the world which allow neighboring countries to cooperate in sharing their water resources, coordinating their development projects, coordinating such things as irrigation, production of electricity.
But do you see it as water cooperation, or do you see it as water rivalry?
Well, I see it as a cooperation. And today with President Sisi, we talked about cooperation, about the very legitimate needs and expectations of Egypt, about the readiness of Egypt to cooperate with Ethiopia and Sudan, and about progress that has been made. There has been some progress already. And of course, there are many technical issues that are still being discussed.
You know that this is an issue that is very disappointing to the Egyptian people. They're highly disappointed, way beyond the president and officials.
Well, I know that this is a very important issue, and I have noticed that there is concern for cooperation to be comprehensive. And that means that Egypt, as a lower riparian country, has to be seen as also the country that needs water of the Nile really in a very vital sense. And I think that that understanding is broadly shared. And of course, I am interested in learning more about this as a question, but also as a way forward. And I would hope that the current negotiations, which are more technical, will provide a very good and balanced solution.
Right, let me in this moment ask you, not in your capacity as a former president of Slovenia or as a candidate for the UN Secretary General post, but as, let me call it, an ambassador of Slovenia to our audience. What would you like to let us know about Slovenia today?
Several things. First, I would like our audience to understand that there is a very deep and well understood affection in Slovenia for Egypt. Many Slovenians have visited Egypt. We have a fairly long history of cooperation at the time of former Yugoslavia, and that sentiment has not changed after the dissolution of former Yugoslavia and creation of new states. So the cooperation is really very good, and we have several good investments, and that is something to be understood. Then we also would like to participate in the current efforts of Egypt for modernization. We talked about the Suez Canal zone today with the president. I mentioned some of our companies that are interested in coming to the zone. participating with technological innovation. And there may be other projects that we should contemplate. So when you're asking me how I see our relations today, I would say excellent history and I think good future. We have to be creative.
Right. And what about Slovenia itself? Where does it stand in terms of its economy these days? How it's progressing and developing since 91 up to today?
Well, Slovenia has had very good development since 1991. We have had steady growth until the financial crisis, which has affected the entire Europe. Slovenia is a member of European Union, a member of Eurozone, and therefore part of that area in Europe which tries to have very stable development. We have a pretty good growth rate by European standards, 2.6, 2.7, which is not very high, but it is higher than...
pretty close to the German one.
Yes, we are advancing pretty well. And obviously we also have a pretty good situation with regard to the budget. Our budget deficit is below 3% of GDP, which is considered to be a good result. But we need to sustain this kind of stable and steady development for the future. So our main task is to develop in a way which would not cause any sort of jolts, any sort of interruptions in the future. So steady growth at the level of development that we have is critical. And of course, we are an export-oriented economy. We are exporting more than 70% of our GDP. And we need to move to the area of investment more rapidly. Both investment in Slovenia, but also outside Slovenia. So for example, we have an Egyptian company in Slovenia, which is active in the electricity sector. And we would like to do more in Egypt as well. So when I'm talking about Slovenia, I always see Slovenia as a part of the world.
Of course.
And since we are meeting in Egypt, that means I see Slovenia as a partner of Egypt.
Right. Now that you're saying being in Egypt, I mean, don't you think, or my impression is, it's taken you some time to visit Egypt. You were in the region, you visited Tunisia 2 years ago.
Yes.
And Tunisia is just, a couple of miles away from Cairo. How come you were not in Cairo, or you were still saw Egypt after the 2013 revolution as not a stable place to visit?
Oh, I was in Egypt last September.
You were?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, that was a shorter visit. Now I came for a week, which makes me very happy because I can meet more people. I have many friends here, friends from my UN days, some of them very close friends. And my wife is with me, so she could visit some of the museums and some of the shops. So, I came for a week, and usually somebody in my position cannot easily take the whole week for an absence.
But I mean, you chose a great timing. The weather is really good these days.
Oh, sure. That was part of the calculation.
Okay.
Certainly, because last year in September, I came only for 2 days.
It was really hot.
Yeah, it was not that. I mean, my friends told me, look, you have to come for 5 days at least, and you have to bring your wife with you.
Okay.
And that is what I accepted as a good strategy, and that's how I came.
All right, great. Let's talk about the United Nations. What is your idea? How do you think we're going to reform the United Nations? There's been a talk ever since the late Dr. Boutros Ghali was the Secretary General about the reform of the United Nations. We don't see it really reforming in any sense till now.
Well, it is probably true that the United Nations has not been sufficiently active, particularly in this region, in the past few years. So the impressions that I find here in Cairo are that the level of activity which was expected with regard to the problems, the security problems of the Middle East region have not been at the level which was expected. And I think that that has had an effect on an overall impression. But then it has to be understood that irrespective of various shortcomings, like insufficient attention to the Middle East region, the UN has made some important achievements in the past few years in terms of an agreement on climate change in Paris at the end of December last year. And before that, in the area of development, where important agreements were achieved about sustainable development goals and also an agenda for financing of development. So there have been some important changes which have a potential of making UN a much more effective organization when it comes to advising member states on development issues. Now, this may not be very visible right now, but it is there. And I should say this has to do with former late Secretary General Dr. Boutros Ghali, who is remembered as a great figure of the United Nations. He wrote among his reports, he wrote 3 fundamental reports which have affected the whole evolution of the UN. One of them was the Agenda for Development. And quite a few ideas from that time, from 1993-94, needed a longer period to be realized. And they are coming now to more specific formulation.
When during the inauguration of Dr. Boutros Ghali, I remember the interpreter made a mistake, and they were talking about Dr. Ghali as a fine statesman, and he translated that as a United Statesman. Funny as it is, but think about it. We look at, we the peoples, we look at it as the United Nations as an organization run by the United States. Is this your impression also as somebody who's acted as a permanent delegate at the United Nations?
Well, talking about that mistake, I can easily visualize the mistake because Dr. Boutros Ghali was also known as a participant in the Camp David peace talks. So he was perceived as somebody who has worked very closely with the United States on a peace agreement, which was not an easy agreement to reach, but which remains fundamental for the whole political dynamic in the Middle East. So I'm not so surprised that such a mistake was made.
But you don't see the UN
but I think it would be going too far to say that UN is actually run by the United States. What is, however, true is that UN owes its emergence and its philosophy to an optimistic note, which is typically American, a can-do approach. And it's not surprising that the idea came from an American president, Roosevelt, a great president, and that it then developed in directions which actually took on board practically all states. Today nobody wishes to leave the United Nations. Everybody wants to be a member of the United Nations, and everybody wants to cooperate. Of course, the United States remains a leading power, and I can tell you from experience that most problems of the world cannot be resolved without some form of participation of the United States. One has to be realistic about this. So participation of the US is really necessary. But that does not mean that the US is running the United Nations. It would be far too simple to say something like that.
In your lecture at the American University yesterday, you were talking about the United Nations is now focusing on international peace and security. And we could see when we come to something like the Syrian crisis, that's I'm sorry to say that the United Nations has failed big time in there, even though, as you said, that there are many parties involved in that issue. But we don't see that the United Nations is capable of pulling together this, even though some of the permanent members of the Security Council are the main players of the crisis.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned permanent members of the Security Council, because much of success of the United Nations in the field of international peace and security depends on cooperation among permanent members. When that cooperation is good, then UN can do more. When it is not good, it can do much less. And we unfortunately had a period of time where the cooperation among the most interested permanent members of the Security Council was not sufficiently good, was actually going in different directions. And I hope that this era is now coming to an end. We have seen the cooperation between Russia and the United States leading to an agreement on ceasefire. It's not a perfect agreement, but it is an important opening. And therefore, I agree with you that obviously the United Nations could not do what it was expected to do, and that this was largely due to the disagreements among the major powers. But it was also a result of a very complicated political picture in the region. Just think about the big neighbors of Syria and their different policies, which were not...
neighbors like Turkey and Iran.
Well, I'm not going to mention any country because too many were involved, and it would take a long time if I wanted to...
I'm talking about them being the big neighbors.
Yeah, the big neighbors, and there are a few more big neighbors, or perhaps countries further
Not that much on the borders.
not necessarily exactly on the borders. But I think at this moment it is really important to pull everything together. We have an opening which shouldn't be missed. This opportunity must not be missed. This is an important opportunity for everybody to look at their policy, to revise it if necessary, and to finally find an agreement about Syria. It's not going to be a simple thing. I am sometimes comparing the complexity of the situation in Syria with the one in, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is close to Slovenia. And I can see how much more complex the Syrian ethnic, religious, and political landscape is. So it would require really very hard work of many to come together to a good solution that can sustain for longer time.
I don't want to really drag you into very political issues, but these are concerns in the region here when they are expecting a UN Secretary General, because we keep on talking about the very respectable Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and we say that Mr. Ban Ki-moon spends his time only being concerned, and he pronounces his concern on an average of twice per day. So we want somebody who's more active into our issues.
Yes.
And I'm a believer in the saying, if you can fix it, break it.
Yes.
And looks like what happened in the region is they couldn't fix it.
Yes.
However, they broke it.
Yes.
And they can't fix it anymore. Take a look at what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Syria, what happened in Iraq and still cannot be fixed. Look at what's happening in Yemen. I could even go as far as say, look at what happened in Egypt under all these circumstances of the Arab Spring and the international interference, like what happened in Libya, for example.
Yes.
So, is there a way out? Is there a way that you can fix, mend? Do you see this would be the mandate of the United Nations? Will it be able to have an input into that?
Well, I think first there have to be certain ground rules which must be respected. The most fundamental among this is respect for sovereignty of states. That should not be affected adversely by international action. In other words, prohibition of use of force except in self-defense or by authorization of the Security Council is fundamental. Everybody must agree to that. That's how one starts a discussion. And if we have that agreement, we would have much less problems in the future. And then secondly, there has to be, when the problems arise, imaginative response from, not only from United Nations, but by others as well. So I think the attempt in Syria to bring Kofi Annan in the early period of the crisis as the negotiator was actually a very good idea. He had a mandate both from the United Nations and from the Arab League. It will be very interesting to learn from him why exactly his mandate could not succeed at that time. And I think that Mr. Ban Ki-moon relied very heavily on his work. Now then came Lakhdar Brahimi, another extremely experienced and highly regarded international negotiator. And he also realized after a while that because of political dynamics in the region and globally, he could not move the process towards a solution. Now we have Staffan de Mistura, another very experienced UN diplomat, and he has a degree of success. So I think that one has to appreciate the complexity of the picture and the effort of the UN to bring to the picture some of their most experienced, most effective, most respected negotiators. Sometimes diplomatic negotiations do not succeed. Sometimes they do not succeed early enough. But that does not mean that they shouldn't be persistent. And now we are in a situation when that's really critical.
There will come a time when the Libyan people will call for indemnities for the European and the Western intervention in their country at a certain stage militarily and leaving it in the state of chaos it is in. And I believe maybe this should apply also to Iraq along the times, ever since the times of Saddam and the invasion of Iraq and so on. Will the United Nations stand by the people of the region when they are asking the United States and the Western powers to take responsibility for the damage that they caused to this region?
I believe that the situation is slightly more complex because the actions against Iraq started after the Iraqi aggression against Kuwait. That's the beginning of the problem. And as you know, that...
with a difference of 12 years,
oh,
maybe,
sure, yes, but
between
without...
that and the claims of the United States of nuclear armament and so on, which proved not to be true.
Yes, well, you're right in your analysis, and I think that nowadays you would not easily find people anywhere in the world who would claim that the choice of military action in 2003 was wise or within the framework of the Charter.
And 2011 in Libya.
Yeah, well, there I think the situation was slightly different because there was an authorization of the Security Council for the military action in Libya, because the threat to people in Benghazi was really very severe. Now the question is whether that authorization was executed adequately or whether follow-up to it was organized properly. And here, of course, I am sure that there will be a big debate in the future because the status of the situation in Libya is really dramatic. Now, the UN estimates that 2.6 million out of the total population of 6 million people, almost one half, depends on humanitarian assistance. So it's really a very grave situation, which is a result of several factors, including international factors. So that will, that discussion will come later. But now I think the priority should be to join forces in helping the political process, because otherwise we are going to have difficulties and chaos for a long time.
And the chaos is affecting Europe at this stage with the case of the refugees. And I believe you had a point of view ever since you were president about Europe being able to bring in legally, other than illegally, immigrants in order for the older continent to have a youthful kind of people. To the extent that sometimes it crosses my mind, like all what happened was in order to bring young people into Europe, and all of a sudden the Syrians are welcome there, and then all of a sudden the Syrians are not welcome there anymore, and the Turks are making the best out of it, and then the Turks are not making the best out of it, and then they're taking money from the European, and then there's blackmail. It's my opinion. I'm not putting words on your mouth, but I mean, all this is happening. How do you see it with this immigrants issue? Is it of benefit to Europe? Is it harming Europe?
Well, Europe is part of the world. And Europe should not believe that it is possible to isolate itself from the problems of the world, which is an illusion that sometimes defines policies in Europe. One has to be very realistic about that. Europe has had a restrictive visa policy, which I criticized as president. I pleaded for more openness, for visa liberalization. We in the Balkans know that very well because our friends from Bosnia and Serbia could not travel to European Union. Slovenia is in European Union. We would like them to come more often and with less difficulty. When I was teaching at Ljubljana University, I had a student from Macedonia who had to compile documentation of this thick to get the necessary visa to come to study. So we see the absurdity of that policy and that arrangement. Now, of course, it is one thing to try to obtain a better system than to manage a crisis. What we have had since recently, and that has been developing slowly over time, is a very large influx of refugees and also migrants who are not refugees. So we had huge numbers, and European Union was not prepared for these huge numbers. And since it was not prepared, it did not react properly. Europe is still in a search for an approach. I think that even the agreement which was outlined in the past few days is not the final word. This is kind of an agreement out of necessity, but not a solid, stable basis for the future. It may be satisfactory to the political leaders in Europe today for a very short period of time. It may be possible to contain the problem for a while, but then we have to figure out something better than what was agreed to in principle in Brussels the day before yesterday. So I remain critical. I think that Europe is moving from a fortress mentality to not very effective crisis management, and none of this approaches have produced a basis of a good system of, communication of people. I would like many more students to come to Europe, many more people who are bringing expertise, many more people who will then return to their countries and bring their expertise to their countries. We have seen some of that positive development with Turkey over past decades. If you go to Istanbul today, you would see many establishments that have a clear sign of European experience of people who are returning to Istanbul and so forth. So movement of people has to be better organized and better managed. We don't have that. And unfortunately, the last experiences in European Union do not give much encouragement.
Having said that, I mean, one important issue, of course, to us in the region is the Palestinian issue.
Sure.
And during your presidency, and on the 27th of July 2011, the then Prime Minister, now the current President of Slovenia, was saying that Slovenia has its own concerns about a unilateral declaration of an independent state in Palestine. Do you have a fixed point of view right now when we're talking about the Palestinian issue?
Well, on recognition, Slovenia is pushing for a collective movement in the European Union, and that may not seem very promising right now, but it is there. Now, on the issue as a whole, I have a view, of course, and I believe that we need more imaginative international diplomacy. I mean, the kind of lull or the kind of passive period has lasted for too long. I'm aware, for example, of the French initiative, which is now taking place. It's a welcome initiative. The situation has to be unblocked. And then if one looks into the question of what would be the basis for solution, obviously two states, and I would say the Arab League plan of 2002. That is the most comprehensive, the most authoritative political statement that I have seen, which should be revived and should serve as a framework within which then next steps are taken.
Israel keeps on saying that it is really convinced of the two-state solution, but acts contrary to that. Your Excellency, we know that this is the last occupation per se that is present in the 21st century, and it is high time that this gets really solved out.
Yes.
And the votes of 22 Arab states, or maybe 21, or I don't know, 22 right now, to you as a UN Secretary General would probably be so much based on your vision of having a decisive solution to the Palestinian issue.
Well, as I said, I would look for a solution within the framework that I defined, and there has to be a new initiative. Obviously, this French initiative is the main diplomatic activity at this moment. We'll see how far that goes, what results it brings. And obviously, the new Secretary General will start his work in January 2017. We'll see what the situation then would be. But whatever the situation, the basic ideas that I mentioned will be decisive, in my opinion. First of all, imaginative, energetic, sustained diplomatic initiative from the United Nations and, of course, from the other major players in the United Nations. And that would include the Secretary General very clearly. And then I think the substantive part should be inspired by the peace plan of 2002. That would be the direction to go. Of course, I cannot predict what exactly the situation will be, but I'm aware of concerns which very legitimately exist in the region, and I will consult actively with all countries and all actors in the region.
We look at you, Your Excellency. You're a person who was very enthusiastic about the independence of your own country.
Sure.
And accordingly, I'm sure you can feel the aspirations and the needs of the Palestinian people all the same.
Absolutely, I do share that, and I have discussed that when I was president with President Shimon Peres. with Prime Minister Ehud Olmert at that time, with Minister Tzipi Livni. So my views are known everywhere, and my commitment to a two-state solution, which would be a just and fair solution for the Palestinian people, is known. I would also like to add that now, at the time of these political difficulties, and when I do not have I'm not an official, I'm a former president, I continue with my own humanitarian project for Palestinian children from Gaza. We are treating those children who are permanently disabled as a result of wars. We have treated so far 22 children who have lost limb, who need prosthetics, who need assistance. We treat them in Slovenia. We train the therapists from Gaza, and we have established over time an important, I would say, humanitarian presence. And this is only one of the demonstrations of how seriously I feel about the Palestinian problem.
Certainly, humanitarian issues are important, but I'm sure to you personally, independence is by far more important.
Well, independence is fundamental, and of course I'm not suggesting that humanitarian activities can be a substitute for political solutions. Political solutions are the essence, and they have to be pursued. And of course, if elected, I would certainly put the Palestinian issue very high on the agenda.
I have one last question that I'm trying to learn from your experience as a former Yugoslav national.
Yes.
I guess you were 39 when Slovenia was went independent,
Exactly.
which means all throughout your life until you were 39, you were a Yugoslav national.
Correct.
And then you woke up and you're a Slovenian national,
Yes.
not anymore about that. In this region of ours, some people who are Syrians, who are Iraqis, who are, name it, they may wake up one day in the presence of all these plans for restructuring
Yes.
the region, rebuilding it, dividing states, turning countries into different states. How would they feel if they wake up one day to find themselves part of a state that never existed throughout life, unlike Slovenia, which was there before being part of Yugoslavia? How does that feel?
Well, Slovenia was a federal unit within a federal state, and we have had our sense of statehood within Yugoslavia. This was perhaps less visible from outside, but it was very strongly felt inside. We had our complete structure. We had a governmental structure which could work as a structure of an independent state overnight. We had an economy which could function that way. So there, the shock of independence was not that strong. It was there, but it was manageable, and very quickly we defined our own way forward. So, one has to appreciate the differences which exist.
It's a big difference then suddenly.
And then, if you take another example from former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which also became independent, but it has a more complicated internal structure with
because of the ethnic issues.
Yeah, because of ethnic issues, you have Bosniaks who are mainly Muslims, and then Croats who are mainly Catholics, and Serbs who are mainly Christian Orthodox. So there, I think the statehood of Bosnia and Herzegovina was retained, but they had to establish an internal structure based on the idea of cantons from Switzerland. I was very surprised when I first heard about that idea back in the 90s, but eventually it proved the only way forward. So when I think about current situations in the Middle East, I think one has to look at the variety of experience that exists. Of course, Lebanon is one example with the power sharing concepts, power sharing system based on the existence of 18 sects. I know that there are many who are critical of that system, but it is a system that works. Then United Arab Emirates have another system which brings together different Emirates into a single state structure. And I believe when a construction of statehood for Syria or for Libya or for other countries is considered, one has to look into these more complex states which do exist, which have their experience. And I believe that based on that experience, one could look for solutions which would be adequate for countries which need
to maintain their integrity or to split them up into mini states.
No, I think that maintaining integrity would be the first priority, but then in the internal structure has to be adjusted. Internal structure meaning either in terms of power sharing or perhaps territorially based autonomies within states. That could also work. Now, of course, this is for the people of those countries to work out. Outsiders can do very little, but outsiders may summarize the experience they see around the world. And I believe that such assistance could help in the peace talks in Geneva, for example, for Syria. They will talk about an inclusive and effective state structure. Now, what that means exactly will have to be negotiated. And I believe that the experience from other places could be helpful, the places that I mentioned. No two countries are exactly the same, but one can learn. And one can then
but as
use...
you know, the Arab nationals are a bit critical, or a lot critical, of what happened, for example, in Sudan, splitting it into two states.
Exactly.
They're not very fond of the idea.
Well, absolutely. I'm not advocating a splitting of states. What I am advocating is a careful consideration to internal structures. Mechanisms of power sharing, mechanisms of territorially defined autonomies within states, mechanisms which bring these different strands together into a meaningful and legitimate statehood. And of course, this is only at the beginning. I'm sure that these are going to be long processes, but they are inevitable, and we have to face them directly.
Right. Your Excellency, Dr. Danilo Chirk, I'm wishing you the best of luck in your endeavors.
Thank you.
And even better luck when you become the Secretary General in sorting out this big mess that we have called the world.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to be in your shoes, but I'm sure you're capable of doing something worthwhile for the entire world.
Let me say that the United Nations has lived in difficult times ever since its creation. It has never been easy. It's not easy now. It's more complex than before. But we need to face our tasks directly, and I'm prepared to do that.
Best of luck, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. بشكر دكتور دانييلو تشيرك رئيس سلوفينيا السابق ومرشح سلوفينيا لمنصب أمين عام الأمم المتحدة. زي ما احنا شايفين هو ملم جدا بالملفات اللي موجودة في منطقتنا، عنده أفكار ممكن ما يكونش الأفكار اللي طرحها للحلول هي أفضل الأفكار في وجهة نظر حضراتكم، لكن ممكن تكون أفكار قابلة للتطبيق. أهم حاجة إن بيكون في حد وهو بيتكلم عن بلادنا ما بيتكلمش عن تقسيم بلادنا، ولكن إيجاد حلول لأن بلادنا تبقى شغالة بشكل صحيح وما تتعرضش لهذه المؤامرة الضخمة ليها مؤامرة التقسيم. بشكركم ونلقاكم في الحلقة القادمة على خير إن شاء الله. تصبحوا على خير.